5 days earlier, no one in the camp would have believed this moment was possible. The morning air hung cool over the temporary prisoner compound in southern Germany. A light wind moved across the gravel yard, stirring dust around rows of canvas tents and wooden barracks built in haste during the final weeks of the war. American flags fluttered above the headquarters building. Trucks sat parked in neat lines. Somewhere beyond the fence, a generator hummed with steady determination. Nearly 200 men stood silently watching. Some wore American uniforms. Others wore the faded gray of a defeated army. None of them spoke. Their attention was fixed on a single figure standing in the center of the yard. General Friedrich Hartmann was 63 years old. His back remained straight despite months of exhaustion. His silver hair caught the early sunlight. His uniform was worn but carefully maintained. The insignia of rank had lost its authority weeks ago, yet he still carried himself like a man who had spent an entire lifetime giving orders. For several long seconds he remained perfectly still. Then, slowly, he raised his hand in a formal military salute. The gesture was directed toward a man nearly half his age. Captain James Walker stood 20 feet away. 27 years old. Clean-shaven. Calm. The young American officer returned the salute without hesitation. No smile. No triumph. No performance for the crowd. Just respect offered with the same quiet precision. Around them, the camp remained silent. A few American soldiers exchanged confused glances. Several German prisoners stared as though they were witnessing something impossible. Because 5 days earlier, General Hartmann had refused even to acknowledge the young captain's existence. 5 days earlier, he had stepped through the gates of the compound carrying the weight of defeat on his shoulders and bitterness in his heart. The war in Europe had ended, but pride often survives longer than battles. Especially for men who had spent decades wearing stars on their collars and commanding thousands. Hartmann had expected many things after his surrender. He expected paperwork, interrogations, orders from unfamiliar voices. What he did not expect was Captain James Walker. The general remembered that first morning clearly. The smell of damp earth after a night of rain. The sound of boots crunching across gravel. The sight of a young American officer waiting near the processing table. Walker looked more like a college student than a military commander. His uniform was pressed neatly. A wristwatch rested above one glove. A clipboard sat beneath his arm. Nothing about him matched the image Hartmann carried in his mind of a man worthy of command. The general had stopped several feet away and looked directly at him. Walker had offered a polite nod. "General Hartmann," he said evenly. "Welcome. We'll get you settled." The words were professional. Respectful, even. But Hartmann saw only the captain's age. He saw smooth skin untouched by decades of responsibility. He saw a rank far beneath his own. Most of all, he saw a representative of the army that had defeated his country. The yard had gone quiet then, just as it was quiet now. American soldiers watched. German prisoners watched. Everyone understood military customs. Everyone understood what should happen next. Walker offered a greeting. Hartmann simply stared. Then he turned his head and walked past the captain without returning the acknowledgement. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouted insult. The reaction was immediate, though nobody dared say much aloud. A young American sergeant standing near the processing table shifted his weight and looked toward Captain Walker, waiting for some sign of anger. Another soldier tightened his grip on a folder of intake documents. Across the yard, several German officers exchanged quiet glances. They had seen enough military life to understand what had just happened. A greeting had been offered. Respect had been withheld. In another place, under different circumstances, the insult might have carried consequences. Captain Walker simply watched the older man walk away. The gravel crunched beneath General Hartmann's boots. His posture remained rigid, deliberate. He wanted everyone around him to understand exactly what he thought of the situation. A few moments passed before Walker finally looked down at the clipboard in his hand. "Continue processing," he said calmly. His voice carried no irritation, no sharpness, just routine professionalism. The sergeant blinked. "Yes, sir." Work resumed. Papers were stamped. Names were recorded. Trucks arrived and departed through the main gate. Yet the moment lingered over the camp like a cloud that refused to move. Throughout the afternoon, whispers traveled quietly between tents and barracks. Some American soldiers felt the German general had crossed the line. Others believed the older officer was simply struggling with defeat. No one seemed entirely sure what Captain Walker would do next. Hartmann himself expected a response. He had spent more than 40 years in military service. Men carried pride into every army in the world. He knew that rank mattered. Respect mattered. Public insults mattered. By evening, he was almost certain some form of reprimand would arrive. Instead, nothing happened. The camp settled into its normal rhythm. A bugle sounded in the distance. Mess hall workers carried trays through the fading sunlight. Guards rotated shifts. The sky turned orange behind rows of pine trees beyond the fence line. Hartmann sat alone on a wooden bench outside his assigned barracks. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Nearby, several prisoners spoke quietly among themselves. He paid little attention. His thoughts remained fixed on the young captain. Something about Walker irritated him. Not because the man had demanded respect. The captain had done the opposite. He had shown restraint. That somehow felt more unsettling. Hartmann removed his glasses and rubbed tired eyes. The war was over. He knew it. Every prisoner in the camp knew it. Yet surrender remained difficult to accept, especially for men who had built entire identities around command. The next morning arrived cool and gray. Low clouds drifted across the sky. A light mist covered the grass beyond the compound fence. Prisoners lined up for breakfast. Coffee steamed from metal containers. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air. Hartmann stood quietly in line, hands folded behind his back. Then he noticed something unexpected. Captain Walker was already there. Not in an office. Not issuing orders from a distance. He carried a crate alongside two enlisted soldiers. The wooden box appeared heavy. Walker adjusted his grip and helped move it toward the kitchen entrance. One of the soldiers said something that made the captain laugh briefly. The conversation seemed ordinary. Human. Hartmann frowned slightly. In his experience, officers rarely handled such tasks themselves when others could do it for them. Yet throughout the morning, he continued noticing similar things. Walker stopped to speak with a camp medic. He helped unload supplies from a truck. He paused beside a nervous young prisoner and explained paperwork in slow, careful German. Nothing dramatic happened. No speeches. No displays meant to impress anyone. Just small actions repeated throughout the day. Hartmann watched from a distance. At first he assumed it was performance. A calculated attempt to appear reasonable. But performance usually requires an audience. Much of what Walker did seemed to happen when nobody important was watching. By late afternoon, the general found himself paying closer attention than he intended. He was looking for flaws. Looking for arrogance hidden beneath politeness. Looking for proof that the young captain was exactly what he had first assumed. So far, he had found nothing. The second day passed beneath a sky the color of worn steel. Clouds drifted low above the camp, turning the afternoon light soft and gray. General Friedrich Hartmann found himself observing more than participating. The routines of captivity were simple. Roll call. Meals. Paperwork. Waiting. Yet the waiting gave a man time to notice things he might otherwise ignore. Shortly after noon, a supply truck arrived through the main gate carrying medical equipment, blankets, and several wooden crates marked for distribution. The vehicle stopped near the administrative building. Soldiers began unloading cargo with practiced efficiency. Hartmann watched from a distance beside the barracks. Captain James Walker appeared carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. He checked inventory numbers, spoke briefly with the driver, then stepped aside. Everything seemed ordinary until one of the crates slipped from a soldier's grasp. The box struck the ground hard. its contents scattered across the gravel. Bottles rolled in different directions. A few cardboard packages split open. The young soldier froze. He could not have been more than 19. Embarrassment spread across his face. Several nearby men turned toward the noise. Hartmann expected the captain to reprimand him. Perhaps not harshly, but firmly. That was how armies worked. Mistakes attracted attention. Instead, Walker crouched beside the fallen supplies without saying a word. He picked up the nearest bottle and handed it back to the soldier. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, 2 more men joined them. The scattered supplies were collected. The crate was repacked. The entire incident ended almost as quickly as it began. The soldier looked relieved. Walker simply nodded and moved on to the next task. No lecture followed. No public correction. The moment stayed with Hartmann longer than he expected. Small details often revealed character better than grand gestures. Throughout his career, he had served under men who demanded perfection from everyone except themselves. Walker seemed different. That afternoon brought another unexpected observation. A light rain began falling just before 3 o'clock. Not a storm. Just a steady drizzle that darkened the dirt roads and covered the camp in the smell of wet earth. Prisoners returning from a work detail moved quickly toward shelter. One older German prisoner struggled to keep pace. Age had slowed him. His boots dragged through mud. Several yards ahead, the rest of the group disappeared beneath a covered walkway. Hartmann noticed Walker standing near headquarters. The captain saw the same man. Without hesitation, he stepped into the rain and crossed the yard carrying an extra raincoat over one arm. He reached the prisoner, spoke briefly, and handed over the coat. The older German hesitated before accepting it. Walker merely nodded and continued walking. Within moments, he was soaked by the rain himself. Hartmann stared through the drizzle. Again, there was no audience. No reporters. No senior officers observing. Just a simple act that served no obvious purpose beyond helping another human being. The general found it increasingly difficult to fit the captain into the image he had formed on the first day. Late that evening, after supper, Hartmann sat outside the barracks watching darkness settle across the compound. Lights glowed from windows. Voices drifted softly through the cool air. Somewhere beyond the fence, a train whistle echoed across the countryside. A fellow prisoner approached and sat beside him on the bench. Colonel Ernst Keller had served under Hartmann for years. The 2 men had survived long campaigns together. Keller removed his cap and stared toward the headquarters building. "You keep watching the American captain," he said quietly. Hartmann did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the illuminated office window where Walker could be seen reviewing documents beneath a desk lamp. "Do I?" he finally replied. Keller smiled faintly. "More than you realize." For several moments, either man spoke. Then Keller leaned back against the bench. "Perhaps he is not what we expected." Hartmann looked away toward the dark horizon. The statement irritated him because it sounded increasingly true. Yet pride is stubborn. Especially when first impressions begin to crumble. "We shall see," Hartmann said. And for the first time since arriving at the camp, he realized he was no longer waiting for the young captain to fail. He was waiting to understand him. The 3rd morning arrived bright and clear. Overnight rain had washed the dust from the camp roads, leaving the air fresh and cool. Sunlight reflected from puddles scattered across the compound. For the first time in days, the distant hills beyond the fence could be seen clearly against the horizon. General Friedrich Hartmann stood outside the barracks before breakfast, watching the camp wake slowly. A truck engine started somewhere near the supply depot. Metal tools clinked against one another. A cook carried crates of bread toward the mess hall. Everything moved with quiet purpose. Then a commotion near the medical station drew his attention. It was not loud. Just unusual. Several prisoners had gathered nearby, speaking in low voices. Hartmann walked closer, curiosity overcoming caution. Through the small crowd, he saw a young German prisoner sitting on a wooden bench outside the clinic. The man looked exhausted. Pale. Unsteady. A medic knelt beside him, checking his condition. Nearby stood Captain James Walker. The captain held a canteen in one hand and a folded blanket in the other. Hartmann stopped several yards away. The prisoner appeared embarrassed by the attention. He kept apologizing in broken English. Walker listened patiently. Then he handed over the canteen. The prisoner hesitated. Walker nodded once. The young man accepted it and drank. No orders were given. No authority was displayed. The captain simply remained there until the medic finished the examination. Only then did he leave. Hartmann watched him cross the yard and disappear into the administrative building. Something about the scene stayed with him. It was not the act itself. Any officer could have ordered assistance. What unsettled him was that Walker had stayed. Many commanders delegated responsibility. Few remained for the ordinary details. Later that afternoon, Hartmann found himself assigned to a small work detail near the storage sheds. The task was simple. Inventory records needed organizing. The work required no physical strain and provided several hours away from the barracks. Around mid-afternoon, a disagreement erupted between two American soldiers unloading equipment nearby. Their voices grew sharp. One blamed the other for missing paperwork. Frustration spread quickly. Hartmann glanced over instinctively. Years in military service had taught him that small conflicts often became larger ones. Captain Walker arrived moments later. The soldiers immediately fell silent. Hartmann expected discipline. Instead, Walker asked a question, then another. He listened more than he spoke. Within minutes the problem became clear. A delivery manifest had been placed in the wrong folder. A mistake. Nothing more. Walker helped locate the document. The tension disappeared almost immediately. The soldiers returned to work. The captain returned to his duties. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. Hartmann stared at the shelves in front of him. Leadership, he thought, often revealed itself during ordinary moments. Not ceremonies. Not speeches. Not inspections. Ordinary moments. That evening brought the most surprising encounter yet. As prisoners filed into the mess hall, Hartmann noticed an elderly German civilian seated near the entrance speaking with camp administrators. The man appeared confused and nervous. Papers were spread across the table. Translators moved back and forth trying to explain procedures. Hartmann learned later that the civilian was searching for information about family members displaced during the collapse of the war. Records were incomplete. Answers were difficult to find. Most officers would have referred the matter elsewhere. Walker did not. Nearly an hour after supper ended, the captain remained seated beside the old man reviewing documents under a single lamp. Darkness settled outside. The camp grew quiet. Yet the office window remained illuminated. Hartmann saw the scene from across the yard. The captain never appeared impatient. Never looked at his watch. He simply continued helping. The general stood motionless beneath the evening sky. 3 days earlier he had judged the young American within seconds. Age. Rank. Appearance. He had believed those things told the entire story. Now certainty felt increasingly uncomfortable. The young captain possessed something Hartmann had not recognized at first meeting. Something difficult to measure and impossible to fake. Not power. Not ambition. Something quieter. Something stronger. And for the first time since arriving at the camp, General Friedrich Hartmann began to wonder whether the most important officer inside the compound might also be the youngest. The 4th day began with clear skies and the kind of crisp morning air that carried sounds farther than usual. General Friedrich Hartmann woke before sunrise. For several minutes he remained seated on the edge of his bunk, listening to the quiet murmur of the camp coming alive beyond the barracks walls. Boots moved across gravel. Truck engines rumbled in the distance. Somewhere nearby, coffee was brewing. The familiar rhythms of military life remained, even after the war that had once given those rhythms meaning. After breakfast, prisoners were assigned their daily duties. Hartmann expected another routine day. Instead, shortly before noon, an unexpected situation unfolded near the supply yard. A newly arrived German prisoner stood beside a transport truck looking confused and increasingly distressed. He appeared younger than most of the men in the compound, perhaps 20 years old. A translator was not immediately available, and the young prisoner spoke almost no English. Several forms needed completion before he could be assigned housing and work details. The process stalled. Frustration slowly began to show on the young man's face. He glanced around the camp as though completely lost. Hartmann watched from across the yard. So did Captain James Walker. The captain approached carrying a stack of folders beneath one arm. For a moment he examined the paperwork. Then he set the folders aside and pulled a small notebook from his pocket. What followed surprised nearly everyone nearby. Walker began speaking German. Not perfect German. Not fluent German. But enough. Simple words. Careful pronunciation. Patient effort. The young prisoner's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Questions were answered. Instructions were understood. Within minutes the confusion disappeared. The prisoner even managed a faint smile before heading toward his assigned barracks. Walker returned to work as though nothing remarkable had happened. Hartmann remained still. The image lingered. The young American officer could easily have waited for a translator. He could have delegated the task. Instead, he had chosen the slower path simply because it helped another person. The realization unsettled the general more than he cared to admit. Later that afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the horizon. Wind swept through the compound, rattling tent canvas and carrying the scent of approaching rain. Prisoners working outside hurried to secure equipment before the weather arrived. Near one of the storage sheds, a stack of wooden crates shifted dangerously as the wind increased. Several men rushed to stabilize them. Among them was Captain Walker. Rain began falling moments later. Heavy drops struck the ground and quickly turned dust into mud. Yet the captain remained outside until every crate had been secured beneath cover. By the time the work was finished, his uniform was soaked. Hartmann observed the scene from beneath an awning. He noticed something else as well. None of the soldiers around Walker seemed afraid of him. They respected him. There was a difference. Fear created obedience. Respect created trust. The distinction had become clearer with each passing day. That evening, Colonel Ernst Keller joined Hartmann again on the bench outside the barracks. For a while they sat in silence watching lights appear across the compound. Rainwater reflected the glow from windows and flood lamps. Finally Keller spoke. "You were wrong about him." Hartmann did not answer immediately. Across the yard, he could see Walker helping an elderly civilian climb the steps of the administration building. The captain paused to hold the door open before disappearing inside. The gesture lasted only seconds. Yet somehow it carried weight. "Perhaps," Hartmann said quietly. Keller nodded. "The difficult part is admitting it." Neither man spoke after that. Darkness settled over the camp. A cool breeze moved through the trees beyond the fence. For the first time in many years, General Friedrich Hartmann found himself questioning not another officer's character, but his own judgment. And that realization stayed with him long after the lights went out. The fifth day dawned under a sky so clear it seemed almost untouched by the years that had come before it. Sunlight spilled across the compound in long golden bands. Dew clung to the grass beyond the fences. The air carried the scent of pine trees and freshly turned earth. General Friedrich Hartmann stood outside the barracks with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands. Around him, the camp moved through its familiar routine. Guards changed shifts. Trucks rolled through the main gate. Clerks carried folders between buildings. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet something inside him felt different. For days he had watched Captain James Walker. At first with skepticism. Then with curiosity. Now with something he had not expected. Respect. The realization was uncomfortable. Respect earned slowly often is. Shortly after breakfast, an incident occurred near the eastern side of the compound. A delivery vehicle had arrived carrying supplies intended for several nearby facilities. During unloading, one of the drivers discovered that part of the shipment had been incorrectly documented. The inventory numbers did not match the paperwork. The mistake created confusion almost immediately. Several soldiers gathered around the truck reviewing forms and manifests. Voices remained professional, but tension could be felt in the air. Delays meant extra work. Extra work meant longer hours. Hartman watched from nearby as Captain Walker approached. The young officer accepted the stack of papers and began reading through them carefully. No irritation appeared on his face. No visible frustration. He simply examined each page one by one. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Eventually the source of the problem became clear. A clerk at another facility had entered 2 shipment numbers incorrectly. A simple mistake. The kind that happens in every army. One of the younger soldiers muttered something under his breath about incompetence. Walker shook his head gently. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said. "Let us fix the problem instead of finding someone to blame." The words were simple. Yet they seemed to settle the entire situation. The men returned to work. The shipment was reorganized. Within an hour the problem had disappeared. Hartman remained silent. He had spent decades around powerful men. Many believed leadership meant demonstrating authority whenever possible. Walker appeared to believe the opposite. Around noon another moment caught the general's attention. A prisoner named Otto Reinhardt had received a letter from home. Mail arrived irregularly. Some men waited months for news. Others received none at all. Otto stood beneath a tree reading the letter slowly. Halfway through, he lowered the page and sat down heavily on a nearby bench. His shoulders sagged. Whatever news he had received clearly weighed on him. Several prisoners noticed but remained respectfully distant. Captain Walker happened to be passing through the area. He paused. He did not ask personal questions. He did not intrude. Instead, he sat quietly on the opposite end of the bench. For nearly a minute neither man spoke. The wind moved softly through the branches overhead. Finally Walker said something brief. Hartman could not hear the words. Whatever was said, Otto nodded. A few moments later the prisoner folded the letter and slipped it carefully into his pocket. When Walker stood and continued on his way, Otto looked calmer than before. Not happier. Just steadier. Hartman watched the scene from across the yard. It reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. During his earliest years as an officer, before promotions and responsibilities multiplied, he had once believed leadership meant caring for the people under his command. Somewhere along the way that lesson had become buried beneath strategy, reports, and rank. The memory lingered throughout the afternoon. As evening approached, the camp settled beneath warm amber light. Long shadows stretched across the gravel roads. Hartman found himself standing alone near the headquarters building. Through an open window he could see Walker at his desk reviewing paperwork. A lamp illuminated the room. Beside the folders sat a photograph in a simple frame. Family, perhaps. Or friends. The captain looked very young in that moment. Not inexperienced. Simply young. Hartman stood there longer than he intended. Then a thought arrived with surprising clarity. The young American had never once demanded respect. Not on the first day. Not afterward. Not even after being deliberately ignored. And somehow that made the respect he inspired far more powerful than any salute ever could. The 6th morning arrived quietly. A thin layer of mist rested over the fields beyond the camp fence, softening the distant landscape into shades of silver and pale blue. General Friedrich Hartmann stood alone near the edge of the compound, watching the sunrise break through the fog. For several minutes he said nothing. The previous 5 days replayed in his mind with increasing clarity. Small moments. Ordinary moments. The kind most people forget. Yet those were the moments that now seemed to matter most. A salute refused. An insult ignored. 100 opportunities for resentment. None taken. Behind him, the camp slowly awakened. The smell of coffee drifted through the cool air. Doors opened. Boots crossed gravel. Somewhere near the motor pool, an engine turned over and settled into a steady rumble. Hartman remained where he was. Across the compound, He noticed Captain James Walker beginning another day exactly as he had begun every other. No ceremony. No attention. No effort to be seen. The young officer moved from one task to the next with the same quiet consistency. Shortly after breakfast, a small group of prisoners was assigned to help reorganize records inside a storage building. Hartmann was among them. The work was simple but time-consuming. Shelves held hundreds of folders. Names. Dates. Transfers. Inventories. Endless paperwork left behind by a war that seemed determined to document every detail of itself. Around mid-morning, an elderly German prisoner accidentally dropped an entire stack of files. Papers scattered across the wooden floor. The man immediately looked embarrassed. Several younger prisoners moved to help. Before they reached him, another person was already kneeling beside the fallen documents. Walker. Without a word, the captain began gathering papers and placing them back into order. The older prisoner attempted to apologize. Walker merely shook his head and handed him the first completed stack. Work resumed. Nothing more was said. Hartmann watched the exchange carefully. The realization came suddenly. The captain behaved the same way whether people were watching or not. There was no difference. No public version. No private version. Just the same steady character repeated again and again. By afternoon, sunlight filled the compound. The mist was gone. Warm air moved through the open windows of the administration building. Hartmann passed by on his way back from a work assignment and noticed voices coming from inside. The door stood partially open. He glanced in. Several American officers sat around a table discussing logistics and transportation schedules. Walker was among them. For a moment Hartmann observed unnoticed from the hallway. One of the older officers complimented Walker on the efficiency of the camp. The young captain seemed uncomfortable with the praise. Instead of accepting credit, he immediately mentioned the medics, clerks, drivers, and enlisted soldiers who kept operations running smoothly. The conversation moved on. Yet the moment stayed with Hartmann. Some men collected recognition. Others redirected it. The distinction mattered. As evening approached, Colonel Ernst Keller found him sitting on the familiar bench outside the barracks. The sky glowed orange above the trees. Long shadows stretched across the yard. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally Keller looked toward the headquarters building. "You know what troubles you, do not you?" he asked. Hartmann gave a faint smile. "I believe I do." Keller waited. The general folded his hands together and stared toward the young captain crossing the compound in the distance. "I spent 5 days searching for weakness," he said quietly. "Instead I found character." The words hung between them. Simple. Honest. Difficult. Keller nodded slowly. Nothing more needed to be said. For years Hartmann had believed respect flowed from rank, age, authority, and achievement. Yet every day inside the camp had challenged that belief. The young American possessed none of the advantages Hartmann once considered essential. He had not earned respect through fear. He had not demanded it through position. He had earned it the slower way. The harder way. Through conduct. Through consistency. Through quiet choices repeated when no reward was guaranteed. As darkness settled across the compound, General Friedrich Hartmann made a decision. The following morning, before the day truly began, he intended to correct a mistake he had carried for 6 long days. The 7th morning arrived with remarkable stillness. The sky above the compound was clear and pale blue. Sunlight touched the tops of the pine trees beyond the fence before reaching the camp itself. A light breeze moved across the gravel yard. The day had not fully begun. Most prisoners were still making their way toward breakfast. Guards spoke quietly. Trucks remained parked. For a few brief minutes, the entire compound seemed suspended between night and morning. General Friedrich Hartmann stood outside the barracks wearing the same carefully maintained uniform he had worn every day since arriving. His boots were polished. His collar was straight. His posture was as rigid as ever. Yet something had changed. The weight he carried now was not defeat. It was clarity. Across the yard, Captain James Walker emerged from the headquarters building holding a folder beneath one arm and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. He appeared unaware that anyone was watching him. Like every morning before, he seemed focused entirely on the work ahead. Hartmann took a slow breath. Then he began walking. The distance between them was not far. Perhaps 30 feet. Yet each step felt significant. Several soldiers nearby noticed the movement. A clerk carrying documents slowed his pace. 2 guards near the gate glanced toward the center of the yard. Even Colonel Ernst Keller, standing outside the barracks, understood immediately what was about to happen. Walker looked up as the older man approached. For a moment neither spoke. The morning air remained quiet around them. Hartmann stopped a few feet away. 6 days earlier he had stood in nearly the same place. 6 days earlier pride had guided his actions. 6 days earlier he had looked at the young captain and seen only youth. Only rank. Only assumptions. Now he saw something entirely different. Walker waited patiently. No expectation appeared on his face. No demand. No satisfaction. Just calm attention. Hartmann studied him for a final moment. Then, with deliberate precision, the German general straightened his shoulders and raised his hand in a formal military salute. The gesture was flawless. Years of discipline guided every movement. For a heartbeat, the camp seemed to stop breathing. Nearby conversations ended. Boots stopped moving. Even the breeze felt quieter. The salute remained fixed. Offered freely. Offered willingly. Offered without being requested. Walker looked at the older man. Surprise flickered briefly across his face. Then he set the coffee cup aside. Without hesitation, he returned the salute with equal precision. Neither man spoke. They did not need to. The exchange lasted only seconds. Yet everyone who witnessed it understood its meaning. Respect had not been demanded. It had been earned. Slowly, Hartmann lowered his hand. Walker did the same. For a moment they simply stood there facing one another beneath the morning sun. Finally the general spoke. His voice was steady. "Captain Walker, I misjudged you." The words hung in the air. Honest. Direct. Walker regarded him quietly. Then a faint smile appeared. Not a victorious smile. Not a triumphant one. Simply understanding. "I appreciate that, General," he said. Nothing more. No lecture followed. No reminder of the insult. No attempt to make the moment larger than it was. That, more than anything else, affected Hartmann. The young officer had been given an opportunity to stand above him. Instead, he stood beside him. Around them, the camp slowly returned to life. Men resumed walking. Conversations restarted. Vehicles moved through the gates. Yet something subtle had changed. Not in the camp. In Hartmann himself. As he turned and walked back toward the barracks, the morning sunlight felt warmer than before. The burden of pride he had carried for 6 days seemed lighter. Behind him, Captain James Walker picked up his coffee, tucked the folder beneath his arm, and continued toward another ordinary day. And somehow that ordinary response made the moment unforgettable. The days that followed passed with quiet steadiness. Summer sunlight continued to sweep across the compound each morning. Trucks came and went. Reports were filed. Letters arrived. Life moved forward in small, ordinary steps. Yet the brief exchange in the center of the yard lingered in the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. General Friedrich Hartmann returned to his routines, but those who knew him noticed subtle changes. The rigid distance he had maintained during his first days gradually faded. He spoke more often with fellow prisoners. He listened more carefully. At times he could even be seen standing near the fence line in conversation with American personnel about farming, weather, or life before the war. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Just people speaking to one another as people. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the salute, Hartmann found himself sorting records inside the administration building. The assignment required cooperation between prisoners and camp staff. Several tables had been arranged beneath open windows. Warm air carried the scent of pine and freshly cut grass through the room. Captain James Walker was seated at the far end reviewing transportation schedules. For hours they worked in relative silence. At one point Hartman glanced up and noticed the captain studying a photograph resting beside a stack of documents. It showed a modest farmhouse, a porch, and a family standing together beneath a large oak tree. Walker caught him looking and smiled faintly. "Oklahoma," he said. Hartman nodded. "Home." The captain's smile widened slightly. "Yes." The conversation lasted only seconds. Yet somehow it revealed more than many long speeches ever could. Two men from different countries, different generations, different armies, both thinking about home. By late August, rumors began circulating that several prisoners, including senior officers, would soon be transferred to another facility. Lists were prepared. Names were checked. Departure dates were discussed. Hartman eventually found his own name among them. The news did not surprise him. Transfers were common. Still, when the morning arrived, he stood for a long moment outside the barracks before collecting his belongings. The compound looked much as it always had. Gravel roads, wooden buildings, flags moving gently in the breeze. Ordinary things. Yet the place no longer felt quite the same as it had on the day he arrived. A transport truck waited near the gate. Prisoners climbed aboard one by one. Hartman carried a small bag beneath one arm. As he approached the vehicle, he noticed Captain Walker standing nearby reviewing final paperwork. The young officer looked up. Their eyes met. Neither man seemed eager to turn the moment into something larger than it was. Hartman extended his hand. Walker accepted it immediately. The handshake was firm. Simple. Honest. "Take care of yourself, Captain," the general said. Walker nodded. "Safe travels, General." No audience gathered. No ceremony followed. The truck engine started. Men climbed aboard. Papers were signed. The day continued. Yet as the vehicle rolled toward the gate, Hartman looked back one final time. Walker was already returning to work. Clipboard under one arm. Another problem to solve. Another ordinary day to manage. The general watched until the headquarters building disappeared from view. Years later, long after the uniforms had been folded away and the war had become history, he would remember many things imperfectly. Dates would fade. Names would blur. Details would disappear. But one memory remained sharp. A young captain who had been offered disrespect and answered with dignity. A man who never demanded honor, and therefore received it freely. Because in the end, the lesson was not about rank. It was not about victory. It was not even about war. It was about character. And character, once witnessed clearly, is impossible to forget. He never demanded respect. That was why he earned it.